Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Let me start by thanking the sponsors of the annual program of seminars of the Cardozo Foundations, whose logo marks are exhibited in front of me and behind me. And second, but not less important, let me thank you, both the Australian ambassador and the General Counsel in São Paulo, for making this possible. Thank you so much, Professor Gary Banks, for making the time to be here with us. I immediately and gladly accepted the offer that you placed before us, that we hold a meeting here with having Professor Gary Banks as our guest speaker. As I think we all know, Australia has been at the cutting edge of introducing innovation and enhancing productivity in its economy and society and private and public sector among OECD countries. Professor Gary Banks has held key positions, has been a leader in this effort in various positions within the Australian government, within independent agencies that have been created to lead this effort in his country. He has held key positions in OECD, the institution itself. He is now back to his academic life, but still very productive and innovative. So we are here to listen to you, and then for about 45 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A with the audience. We just have to make sure that we stop at 12, so that because they have other commitments afterwards. So without much further ado, the floor is yours for 45 minutes, Professor Banks.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Do I need to push this, or is it?
No, it's on.
Okay.
You just have to.
You can hear me? Okay. So I have to apologise in English. I should say in Australian. That I don't speak Portuguese. But unfortunately, there's no school in Australia that has Portuguese as the second language that students learn. In my case, I learned French, like a lot of my contemporaries. I learned that at school, which has turned out to be handy at the OECD, but not so handy in Brazil. So my apologies for that. Brazil and Australia, it always strikes me, have a lot of things in common. We both have beautiful countries. We both have very nice people. We have important resource sectors in both of our countries. We also have federal systems of government with all the additional complexities and interest and challenges that brings. But we also both have a history of policies and institutions that have actually undermined economic growth and reduced the capacity of our economies to raise the living standards of our people. We share that in common. In the Australian case, I think the onset of a crisis in the mid-80s led to a rethink of the way policy was made in Australia, and we undertook a range of reforms that I'll talk about in a moment, which for Australia came at a very important time for a number of reasons that I'll talk about. I'm not here to tell you that you must do what we did. Australia and Brazil, although we're very similar in all of those ways, we're also very different countries. Brazil has an area 10% larger than Australia, which is not much different, but you have a population a bit larger than 25 million people, which is our population. That probably fits into Sao Paulo, huh?
Yeah, in the metropolitan area of Sao Paulo.
So we have a landmass as big as yours, but with a population the size of Sao Paulo or something. So that is quite different. And your federal system, obviously, is far more extensive than ours and fragmented. So some of the things that we were able to do, obviously will present different challenges to Australia. Now, I don't know whether it's reassuring or not to say that the challenges that face reformers are not new challenges. They're challenges that have been around for a long, long time. And I love to use this quote from Niccolo Machiavelli, especially when I'm in Italy, because it shows that the fundamental challenge that face any reformer is an inherent challenge in our societies, and not just democratic societies either. Machiavelli was not talking about a democratic polity in his remark. The reformer has enemies in all those who profit by the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in those who would profit by the new. Well, we can break that down, and I'm sure this is not telling you anything, but just to elaborate on the challenge that reformers faced, is that inevitably the sort of reforms that are needed to enhance productivity and incomes that depend on productivity more than anything else are reforms that often will involve some losers as well as winners. The losers know who they are very clearly and resist. The winners aren't always sure who they were going to be or how much is at stake. So there's an asymmetry there. And also the costs of reform, even the adjustment, the disturbance to things happens at the beginning, whereas the benefits happen a bit later. So we find that sectional interests tend to be better informed, better organised, and better at influencing policy outcomes and the politics than consumer groups, for example, or the generality of citizens and taxpayers. And in fact, citizens often may only hear one side of the story. They hear a bit from the government about the need for reform, but they hear a lot from those who are resisting reform, who have most to lose. And government administrative structures can also make it hard for governments themselves, because most administrations are fragmented along the lines of industry, which tend to focus on what's good for specific industries or specific segments of society, rather than what would make sense for society or an economy as a whole. And of course, we both live in federal systems, which complicate matters considerably further in terms of building a political consensus about what is beneficial to society as a whole. What is good for one state may not be seen as good for another state, because states almost by definition have different characteristics. Well, in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, Australia looked like this. It was a country that was profoundly anti-competitive in its policies and regulatory frameworks, had very high levels of protection against international exchanges. It was very interventionist in terms of the role of government in relation to a whole range of industries where government need not necessarily be so strong. And it was profoundly redistributive in terms of the policies in all sorts of ways, across industries, between business and consumers and taxpayers, and then also redistributive across regions in Australia. Government monopolies were very strong in public infrastructure. Well, that combination of circumstances which defined the era up until the mid-1980s, and which somebody told me in Brasilia, this set of characteristics of Australia before reform isn't too different to the set of characteristics of Brazil today.
It's strangely familiar.
So, but I leave that for you to judge. But certainly in the case of Australia, this set of policy characteristics did not have good economic effects. We had fragmented, low-scale industry at very high cost, very uncompetitive, unable to compete internationally, protected by high tariffs. We had high-cost public infrastructure services, energy, water, telecommunications, very high cost, particularly for business, often cross-subsidising households or consumers. Rigid labour markets, central prescription about what you pay your workers, how you pay them, how you use your workers, how you employ them. Low rates of innovation, including research and development, compared to the average for the OECD. Australian industry was lagging behind in technology and innovation. Very low foreign trade participation. For a country our size, our participation in international trade was about half the OECD average. And low productivity growth, and as I've said there, resulting stagnant per capita incomes. Now, in another presentation I give, I show the links between what happens to per capita incomes and what happen and the productivity situation. The bottom line, which Paul Krugman from MIT in the USA has summarised, is productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. It provides the only sustainable basis for raising the living standards of our citizens. And in Australia, productivity growth was low. In fact, through the 60s, 50s, 60s and 70s, it was about half the average productivity growth for the OECD area. Well, as a consequence of all of that, by the mid-1980s, Australia had slipped down the international ranking in terms of per capita GDP. At the beginning of the 20th century, Australia was number one in the world in terms of per capita GDP. I think number two was Argentina.
Well, number three.
Number three.
Canada, Australia,
yes,
and Argentina.
That's right. So Australia and Argentina, I'm not sure about Canada, followed this trajectory here from number one, number two, number three, in Australia's case, number 14 by 1983. The difference for Australia was that reclaimed our higher ranking. We never got back to number one, but in the period after 1983, we saw a reversal of that. Some commentators referred to this as the Australian miracle, whereas Australians think that we actually, if it was a miracle, it was a planned miracle that involved a lot of hard work. Actually, the word miracle has reappeared in Australia recently with our Prime Minister being re-elected, who said that it was a miracle. But this economic miracle involved a lot of hard work, I think, as our Prime Minister's miracle did more recently as well. So what was responsible for the Australian miracle, as it has been called by the IMF and others? And the answer is a dramatic transformation from the kind of Australia that I showed you in that earlier slide, the very profoundly anti-competitive Australia of the 60s and 70s, through a range of reforms that were essentially orthodox reforms of the time, involving trade liberalisation of capital markets, taxation reform, including subsequently the introduction of consumption taxes to take some of the weight off income taxes, but also reducing high marginal tax rates. On the other hand, giving some tax concessions in areas of market failure, such as research and development and innovation. So taking some things away from industry, but providing some other things where industry needed support and where society could be shown to benefit from that support. A range of pro-competitive infrastructure reforms to the public utilities that involve more commercialisation, corporatisation, and more competition. In some cases, also privatisation, but not in all. And the restructuring of public utilities to allow more contestability of the contestable parts of those businesses. Labour market deregulation. Labour market regulation is the politically most difficult area of regulation to reform in the Australian experience, but reforms were introduced in the late 1980s to allow enterprises to do deals with their own workers that made sense for their own businesses in their own regions. Previously, all the deals were done centrally, and there were central regulations about wages and conditions and much else beside that applied to you as a business, whether you were in a country area or whether you're in the middle of the city, and whether you're in so there was a degree of industry uniformity, but not one that took into account the circumstances of different firms operating in different parts of the country. So that changed, and that was a dramatic improvement in flexibility in the Australian labour market that has been very beneficial ever since in Australia. And finally, the culmination of a lot of the reforms, including reforms that were taking place at the state level to give them national coherence, was what we called in Australia the National Competition Policy, which had a range of actions under it, including in the infrastructure area, but also a systematic review of anti-competitive regulation across all the jurisdictions in Australia by introducing a new very radical principle. And that very radical principle from an Australian perspective, and probably internationally, was that a regulation could only be maintained, if it was an anti-competitive regulation, it could only be maintained if it could be demonstrated that the benefits to society were greater than the costs of that regulation. Now, of course, many anti-competitive regulations got there in the first place because the benefits to the minority group were much bigger, and it was the wider community who were paying the costs. So as a consequence of what was called the Legislation Review Program, which covered 2,600 regulations across the whole country, was that many regulations were reformed or removed that had previously been impeding competition. I mentioned just one yesterday. For example, we had the regulation of shopping hours. So if you wanted to do your shopping in Australia, you had to shop on Monday to Friday between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Bad luck if you ran out of something on the weekend. Huh? And this was seen as very important socially. Interestingly enough, when one jurisdiction freed up shopping hours, government discovered that people actually didn't want to shop just on Monday to Friday between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. They actually like shopping on Sunday afternoon. This was a new revelation. So when you give people choice, they do surprising things. And this is all good, I think, for society. So the result of all of this was a dramatic increase in Australia's multi-factor productivity growth through the 90s, which studies have shown was directly associated with these reforms. We saw a surge in productivity in the public utility space, for example, a doubling of productivity. In many cases, prices halved. Consumers were far better off. Industry had much lower input prices as a result of this. And we saw a lot of expansion of firms, new entry of firms. And I put the chart on the right to show you that coinciding with this improvement in productivity was an increase in research and development. And we saw Australian firms suddenly appreciating how important it was to innovate, and they were getting some subsidies for that, but also they were facing quite strong market pressure to reduce their costs and to find new ways of doing things that were more appealing to consumers.
And the reforms were initiated and conducted by governments of the two different parties, or?
So this is an interesting thing. The reforms that began in the 80s were reforms that were initiated by the Labor government, which is a government of the left. In Australia, a government of the left isn't so far from the centre, and a government from a right isn't so far from the centre. So the difference between the left and right has not been so great in Australia, except on some individual issues from time to time. But broadly, there hasn't been such a big difference. But at that stage, a government of the left introduced those reforms. But interestingly enough, none of those reforms were reversed when a government of the right came in. And in fact, the national competition policy continued predominantly under a government of the right, even though they'd been initiated by a government of the left. The other point that I'd make was that the national reforms that involved all jurisdictions of the Australian Federation involved jurisdictions of the left and the right. So a common sense that there was a problem, there was a looming crisis, was shared politically across the spectrum, which is the soundest way, actually. If you can get agreement about the problem across the political divide, it makes it a lot easier to get agreement about the solution. Where Australia has failed, and I'm sure Brazil has also had problems, is where there's no political agreement about the problem. So this has been the most fundamental and important thing. And what I'll be talking to you a little bit about in a moment is how we got agreement about the problem and some of the institutions that enabled Australia to do that. So that, for example, the Labor government introducing reductions in protection, which were quite significant over time. I mean, over a period of 10 or 15 years, we saw protection fall very substantially from effective rates of 40% down to about 2 or 3%. Those reforms were not criticised or opposed by the opposition party at the time. In fact, the opposition party said we should go faster, which made it much easier for the government to do this. So agreement about the problem was a fundamental thing in the Australian case. Well, what were the benefits that flowed from these reforms? Because they were opposed by those who said, for example, this would be very, very bad for labour. In fact, real wages benefited very significantly from productivity growth. As I said earlier, and as Krugman in that aphorism, pointed out, in the long run, it's productivity growth that underpins real living standards. And that comes through, as you can see in this chart, with productivity and real wage growth. That's real wage growth deflated by the CPI. Interestingly, in Australia, others argued that reforms, for example, protection reform, would be harmful to people on low incomes. Public utility reforms. In fact, the opposite was the case. Overall, we saw that all segments of the income spectrum benefited from the reforms. And in fact, one of the arguments that was most successful in prosecuting the case for trade liberalisation was that protection is a regressive tax. It's a tax that hits people on low incomes proportionally harder than the people on high incomes, because of the composition of the goods that they buy and how those goods loom much larger in their total expenditures than for someone who's very wealthy, for example.
What's the period covered by this graph?
So this period would be from about 1990 to about 2005, I think, which would include the period of the national competition policy, but also include some of the previous reforms, including trade liberalisation reforms. So it's a significant period, and it's based on modelling. It says there commission estimates, and I'm going to talk about the commission soon because it was an important institution in making the case. Well, so if Machiavelli's right, and we had that other slide showing all the reasons why reform is so difficult, how did Australia manage to do this? The OECD in 2010 conducted a survey of its member countries, 32 or so member countries, looking at examples of successful reform in those countries. This report, which I'd recommend to you if you have a chance to find it, is called Making Reform Happen. And it looked at the features that were present in successful reforms. By successful reform, I mean a reform that achieves what it says it will do in terms of bringing benefits. Many things are called reform that don't really bring benefits. In fact, the word reform sometimes, I think, is misused a little bit. But in this case, reform that achieves what it says it will do, and reform that is sustainable, that's not immediately reversed when there's a change of government, for example. So what were the features that led to those kind of reforms? And this is the list that the OECD came up with, which in the Australian case, we can tick all of those boxes. And I won't go through in great detail. Some of them will be obvious to you. Very hard to bring about a significant reform program that involves changing the status quo unless there's sufficient support. I say sufficient support. It doesn't need to be complete support, but at least not hostile opposition. And whether there's sufficient support depends on effective political communication. Now, in Australia's case, we had both of those things. We had very effective political selling of the need for reform based on the third point there, solid research and analysis which showed the general public that there would be gains to households from reform. The fourth point the OECD makes is there needs to be adequate time, and often successful reform only occurs after more than one attempt. In Australia, we introduced the consumption tax, a goods and services tax, after about three attempts, if not four, over a period of nearly 20 years. The first attempt was made in the mid-1980s, and we only secured a consumption tax by about the year 2000. So it took quite a while to do that. Political leadership obviously is very important for all of those things. And the last thing I mentioned there, which is actually not in the OECD list, but it was very important in Australia, was that success breeds success. If people can see that reform has actually delivered some benefits, has reduced the price of electricity, for example, or has made it easier to get a job, then they're more likely to be supportive of extra reforms. And in the Australian case, that was so. But there are some additional Australian ingredients, I think.
You skipped burning platform?
Yes, right, I skipped the burning platform. So the OECD has mentioned that a crisis, I think Churchill is famous for many quotes, but one of Churchill's famous quotes was, there's nothing like a good crisis for reform, something like that, right?
You shouldn't miss one.
You shouldn't miss one, yeah. So the OECD found that the countries that had introduced successful reform, in many cases there'd been a crisis. And when there's a crisis, people are more prepared to accept even revolutionary change to do something because they know the status quo is not working anymore. So it's a way of getting the public concentrating their minds. In Australia's case, however, it was more the perception that if we didn't do something, there would be a crisis. It was a crisis that we needed to avoid rather than a crisis that we were currently having. And that was a very interesting distinction, and I think Australian political leaders have had the knack of being able to conjure up the image of a crisis if reform is not done in a timely way. And this has been repeatedly done in Australia. So in terms of some special aspects of the Australian experience, one was that the sequencing and pace of change were quite important. In Australia, the first reforms, essentially, after floating the Australian dollar, freeing up the exchange rate, the first reforms were opening the border to goods and services and then investment. Now, the orthodoxy from the World Bank at the time was that should be the last thing to do, because you want your economy to already be freed up internally and flexible and adaptable before you expose it to international competition. In Australia, this worked very well in a political economy sense because exposing industry to international competition led industry to look at its own costs and which costs were the result of other policies in Australia that needed reform. So we saw a big push, for example, for infrastructure reform that resulted from industry now facing more competition on its product side, wanting to reduce the cost of its inputs. And infrastructure and labour market were two critical sources of high input costs for Australian industry, which suddenly became the focus of attention for a new wave of reform. So progressively, while we started at the border, the reform program spread, picking up other sources of impediments to competitiveness for firms that were now facing international competition. But the word gradually is important. We didn't do this overnight. The opening up to international competition was phased in over time, and I can talk some more about the detail of that. Australia's experience, both in good times and bad, is that trying to do too much at once can be problematic. And so the sequence matters, and choosing the priorities has been quite important in Australia. At a later stage in our history, when we had a big agenda where we tried to do a lot of things, social and economic and environmental, all at the one time, this was not such a successful experience. For a start, the public soon gets reform fatigue. There's a loss of focus. There's only so much expertise that can go into implementation, etc., and you can, in the end, achieve less by attempting more than you would achieve if you focused on a few things. The public hates surprises and industry hates surprises, and Australia's experience has been where reforms have been announced with very little preparation, these have been very hard reforms to sustain and often have been reversed at the next election. And finally, the point that I make here is that having institutions that supported evidence-based policy making, which is the one way of summarising all the rest that I've been talking about, in other words, preparing the case, preparing the public, and then giving attention to implementation. Having institutions that supported that and made it easier for our political leaders by having evidence and also by helping to educate the public about the trade-offs in the reform choices was very important in Australia. Now, what do I mean by evidence-based policy? I've got this little sequence here which all of you will, I'm sure, agree with. You might want to add some extra bars. Certainly consultation is very important to the assessment period. You know, what's the problem? How can government help? What are the options for dealing with something? In Australia, that has been a very important part of the process. However, we also see more commonly a process that looks like this, which when we try to make a joke, we call it policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. In other words, a policy decision is dreamed up and the evidence has to be found to support that policy. In Australia, that's not worked so well, because there's a little thing called unintended consequences. And that can be political as well as economic. And it often arises where there has not been enough attention to assessment and testing with the public different policy choices. So the assessment and the options part is very important. And in Australia, we've had a number of institutions which have assisted government in this process and have provided information which, by and large, the public has trusted. One of the problems that we have in Australia, I don't know whether you have in Brazil, is the public often doesn't know who to believe, and sometimes is least likely to believe a politician.
It doesn't happen here.
Doesn't happen. So everyone trusts your politicians in Brazil. I'm very pleased to hear that. In Australia, we have a bigger struggle. So it's quite important. So it's quite important that there are sources of information that that the public can access. When I say public, I mean industry groups and representatives, consumer groups, etc., who have a stake in the economy and the reform process. It's important that there are sources of information that they feel they've had an opportunity to influence, but also that have been conducted in an independent way and haven't been just driven by the politics. And Australia, to the extent that we've done something a bit different to other countries, it's in this area that we have some innovations in terms of institutions that have made a big difference to the reform progress. This slide sets out 4 kinds of institutions that have contributed to the reform programs in Australia. The first, and the one I know best because I headed this institution for 14 years, is the Productivity Commission, and I'll come and talk more about that. But its job was really at the front end of the process to look at problems that society and the economy was facing, the source of those problems, what the solutions could be, to consult with the public and have submissions and so on, and then provide advice to government. Because we have a federal system, our national competition policy was overseen by a National Competition Council, which was monitoring the extent to which agreements were actually implemented. Now, that was very important because the second innovation in the national competition policy, apart from turning on its head the test of whether a regulation should be kept, was that the federal government promised to make payments to the states if they implemented the reforms. So these competition payments were quite an important way of creating an incentive for the states to follow through, and the National Competition Council made sure that this was happening. And if the National Competition Council said the state of, let's call it the state of Victoria, has not implemented certain reforms, then a certain amount of money would be withdrawn from the state of Victoria. And we found it interesting that this made a big difference to how the different states thought about the reform process. Thirdly, we have had benchmarking of public sector services. This is where services provided at the state level have been compared with each other in terms of efficiency, effectiveness and equity in a report that comes out once a year, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And finally, the screening and reviewing of regulations has been important. There's an expression that we use sometimes in Australia, and I think I brought it to the OECD, which is called regulate first, ask questions later. And this is what I'd call the standard approach to regulation making. So in Australia, we tried to turn that around. Ask questions first and regulate later. And that's a much better way to go. But this was an institution that vetted all new regulation to ensure that the regulation impact assessment showed that it was of net benefit. How much more time do I have now?
Plenty.
Plenty? Well, don't tell me plenty. I'll go for too long. Okay, maybe another 10 minutes.
Yeah, I guess so.
Or 15. Okay. So what is the Productivity Commission? It's a statutory agency. It has its own statute which defines its role and provides it with independence, that conducts in-depth research and public inquiries on key reform issues that relate to productivity and living standards in Australia. It began only with economic issues, but progressively over time it's looked at social and environmental policy issues as well. And I'll come back and say a bit more. It was designed, you could say it was designed to deal with the Machiavelli problem. Right? It was designed to provide information that enabled those who benefit from reform to suddenly become more of a political force rather than just who are those who may be the potential losers, and to promote the public interest. And thirdly, it's an organisation which evolved over time from an organisation, the Tariff Board, whose main job was to advise the government about raising tariffs, to an organisation whose main job was to advise the government about reducing tariffs. So an institution in Australia, institutional evolution has occurred in which some of the features remained the same, but some changed dramatically. In my next slide, we'll talk a little bit about that. So one of the design principles of this anti-Machiavelli institution was independence. And the Commission, although it's within the public sector and depends on government for its funding, it has a number of features which guarantee the independence of its decision-making. And this has been fundamentally crucial to whether it has the trust of the public that its recommendations are not unduly influenced by the politics. And of course, one of the jobs of the CEO of this organisation is to ensure that the public perception of independence is not reduced by anything that the Commission does. For example, I used to avoid any opportunity for a photo opportunity with the minister. So the implication of the minister sitting next to you in a photo to announce some policy, for a lot of people would say that policy's already been influenced by the minister. Now, these are small things, but the independence of the organisation was crucial to how it was perceived by the public, and therefore how helpful it could be to the government. The Commission has no executive responsibilities. It's not a regulator. It can't make anything happen. Its only power is through the power of its arguments and the power of the information and evidence that it provides. Now, that can be actually very powerful sometimes, but it does make formal recommendations, but the government does not have to accept them. So you're saying, what proportion of the Commission's recommendations did the government accept? And I actually did a count. I got my staff to do a count, and the answer is about 2/3, about 65% of recommendations were accepted and implemented by the government. But I should also be truthful and say, of the 1/3 that were not accepted, of the 2/3 that were accepted, some of the most important ones were actually in the other 1/3 that were not accepted, often for reasons that the politics were just so sensitive that even having a strong case with good evidence was not enough. In some cases, however, while those recommendations were not accepted initially, they were accepted when the politics changed a little bit, either because a new government came in or because the economic circumstances favoured it. So independence was one crucial design principle. The second was transparency. Everything the Commission does is in the public domain. There's nothing that the Commission does that is not seen by the public in a formal way. Having said that, of course, when the reports come out, the Commission has to brief the Minister and brief the Parliament about what's in them and so on. But the reports themselves are all publicly available. All the submissions that people make are publicly available, and people have an opportunity to respond to that. So no hidden agendas, no covert influence, and an opportunity to promote public debate. And the third principle, design principle, which is embedded in the legislation, is that the Commission's required to take what is called there an economy-wide view, to take you could say national interest view, but to look at the impact on the economy as a whole rather than what's good for the textiles and clothing industry, for example, or what's just good for the automotive industry. Okay? For example, we did a number of inquiries into assistance to the automotive industry, which showed that the cost of that assistance were not justified by the benefits, and that consumers were paying far too much for cars. And again, this was a regressive tax, which made it harder for people on lower incomes to have access to safe cars, etc. And these arguments were made as part of the process of gradually withdrawing assistance from this very politically powerful industry. I don't know whether this rings any bells in Brazil or not. Actually, I just learnt recently that Brazil was making Volkswagen Beetles long after everyone else had stopped making them. Yeah, which I thought was a good thing. I like the Beetles. And I saw a very nice example last night as I was driving back in from the airport. But I don't see many on the roads anymore. Huh?
No, I don't think they're producing them any longer.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Anyway, maybe it's not a shame.
Yeah.
So looking at what's good for the living standards of the community in the broad is very important. And funnily enough, this is not something that any other agency has responsibility for. Treasury departments will think about the macroeconomy and so on, but individual departments, the industry departments thinking about industry, right? Welfare departments are thinking about welfare arrangements, transfers. So to have one institution that's thinking in the broad about living standards and per capita income growth over time for the community as a whole was a new thing for Australia. Okay, so the Productivity Commission is within the Treasury portfolio, but it is independent and it reports to the public as well as to the Parliament. When it conducts a public inquiry, typically the work that the Commission does, the most important work that it does, is work that the government has asked it to do. And this is quite important because it also means the government is required to respond to the reports that it makes. And in the process there that's described in the middle box, you'll see it talks about a draft report publicly released. And in my view, in 14 years heading this organisation, the ability to put out a draft report with policy ideas and get public reaction to them was the most powerful and important part of the process, and often led to revisions to the recommendations in the final report, but also led to the recommendations being more robust because they'd already been publicly tested. Now, I should say that that could be a very vigorous period of debate. If you're making a recommendation in draft form for the automotive industry to have its protection reduced, you can expect that the automotive industry will want to have something to say about that. And so this would lead to a very vigorous debate, and I would become a reluctant TV star occasionally.
But you're forced to go public, right?
Forced to go public.
Instead of trying to back channel and
no back channel.
Yeah.
And the whole purpose of this is to be in the public, not in the back channel. And from the government's point of view, which I'll come to in a moment, this was quite good for the government because the government was not involved. It could sit back, it could watch this process, and it could learn about what was politically possible, not just what was economically desirable. And if the Commission had done its job quite well, the government would see that actually, although the industry resisted these reforms, there were other industries or consumer groups, etc., who were quite supportive. And in the case, for example, of manufacturing protection reductions, the Commission's work helped inform the agricultural and mining sectors that the tax on manufacturing imports ended up becoming a tax on agricultural exports. Now, this is not something that's easy to explain, but the work that was done and so on led to this understanding, which led to the agricultural and mining sectors, the resource sectors, becoming strong political advocates for trade liberalisation, which had not been the case before. I won't go through that in any detail, but I just show you that so you can see a range of the kinds of things that the Commission was asked by the government to provide reports and recommendations on. All of these are quite complex issues, but also quite often contentious, politically contentious issues. And I would argue that the Commission's role is really not to look at small things of red tape, etc., but to look at important areas where reform can make a significant difference. So how did the Commission help government's reform efforts? One was, governments get lots of advice. They get too much advice. But to have one source of advice that they know is based on evidence, analysis, and seeks to be objective and not be influenced by the politics or by the interests of particular parts of the community is quite an important thing for a government to know that. At least to know it. They don't necessarily need to follow that advice, but to have it has been quite important. And indeed, that advice has been very valuable for government in selling the case for reform. There's nothing like being able to say how much household incomes might increase if a particular form could be introduced. Now, in Australia, the national competition policy reforms were projected to increase GDP by 5%. Now, those of you who've done studies on impacts on GDP of different reforms, 5% is a lot. It's very hard to shift the dial of GDP by 5%. So this was quite important. And when a study was done subsequently of the infrastructure reform, so that was the first one was a projection, but when a study was done looking back at what impact the reforms had had just in the infrastructure area, the estimate was 2.5% of GDP just from the public utility reforms. That led to a $7,500 increase in household incomes over that decade. So ammunition against special interests. Often special interests, for good reason, for their own good reasons, have very strong arguments to make, which governments sometimes don't know how to respond to. So one of the functions of the Commission was to provide the government with arguments that could be used against the arguments of special interest. Special interests always cloak their arguments in the national interest. And educating the public, the process of a commission inquiry, which sometimes could take 12 months, was a process of engagement with the public, involvement and so on. And by the end of it, quite often, there was broader public support and coalitions of support than existed before, which made it easier for government. And there's the point that I made earlier about political learning. So I don't want to rush through this, but I'll just quickly go through the next institutions, and then maybe just in two minutes, and then we can have some Q&A. Because it's really the Productivity Commission that I want to talk mainly about. But just to come back to these other institutions, Australia created an institution specifically to oversee reforms that were national and that involved all the states. And the National Competition Council had representatives from the states involved in it, but it had an independent chair and secretariat, and it monitored implementation of reform. And that was quite powerful, partly because it was linked to whether the states would get paid for the reforms by the federal government, but also because it made the process more transparent and the public could see to what extent governments were honouring their commitments. So that was a very important institution in the history of reform in Australia. Another one that relates to our federation, as I mentioned earlier, is the benchmarking of government services. Every year a blue book, as it's called, is produced, which sets out a whole range of indicators of the efficiency, effectiveness and equity of services provided by each jurisdiction. I've got the writing too small, so I don't expect you to read that. But if you look at it from the left of this diagram, the objectives of whether it's education or health services, hospital, in this case it's public hospitals, what are the objectives? What are indicators of equity, effectiveness and efficiency? And then the extent to which different states achieve those indicators is indicated on the right. The ones in black are where there's comparable data for the different states, because all the states collect data in different ways. And in blue is where it's still a work in progress. But, for example, I'm probably the only one who can read these. There's one indicator there which says, second from the top, emergency department waiting times. If you have a heart attack, how long do you have to wait in the emergency department before you get treatment? That's something that people care about. So to know that in the state of Victoria, you only have to wait, like in my case, 20 minutes, relative to if I'd been in Western Australia, for example, and had to wait 40 minutes, that's quite important information. And in terms of pressure on governments to reform, because people would say, if Victoria can do it, why can't WA, why can't Western Australia do it? They're both states of Australia, why can't they? So domestic benchmarking within a federation can be a very powerful thing, whereas international benchmarking, there's always a question that, well, comparing like with like, you know. But those issues domestically. Anyway, it's something that we did in Australia, which has been quite successful. I won't go through the detail of it. And then finally, I've already talked about the Office of Best Practice Regulation, which oversees the vetting of all new regulations and also oversees the reviewing of the stock of regulation. We have quite a large stock of regulation, but I've heard since I've been in Brazil that Brazil holds the world record for the number of regulations. So congratulations.
We are very productive in this respect.
So thank you. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions.